Welcome to this exciting colloquium that we're having today, Ethics of Care, Reflections on Blackness, Art, and the Institution. Thank you all for coming out on a Saturday to participate in what will certainly be an informative and enriching discussion amongst our esteemed panelists.
My name is Delphine Sims. I am a PhD student here at UC Berkeley in the History of Art department.
And I'm Patricia Gomez. I'm a PhD student in the Performance Studies department. We are both co-moderators today for the event and also participating students in the current Cal seminar course entitled Melon Exhibition Graduate Seminar, Diaspora, Migration, and Exile. We would like to say thank you to the many individuals who helped leverage our thoughts and work. Thank you to our fellow classmates who are here for all the work that they have done to help us articulate the concepts behind today's events and encourage Delphine and I to be the class representatives. Thank you to the many individuals at the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive for making this event possible. Most importantly, Director and Chief Curator Lauren Surrender and Director of Education and Academic Relations Sherry Goodman, amongst many, many others who have helped us here. We're also grateful to Cal Conversations Exhibition Series, the Phoebe A. Hearst Museum of Anthropology, and finally, we thank the Andrew J. Mellon Foundation for their generous financial support of our seminar and exhibition.
In this course, Patricia and I, along with 13 fellow students, were fortunate to learn and grow under the expertise of our exceptional professors, Dr. Lauren Kreutz of the Art History Department and Dr. Lee Rayford of African American and African Diaspora Studies. This year-long seminar began in August of 2018 and has been a whirlwind of intellectual curiosity, hard work, effective engagement, and a lot of logistical planning, negotiation, collaboration, and mediation. Our efforts will culminate in an exhibition here at the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive titled About Things Loved on Blackness and Belonging. It will open to the public on May 17th, so please put it in your calendars. We arrived at this show after many months of research and investigation into the practices, histories, and collections of our local institutions, the Phoebe A. Hearst Museum of Anthropology and the BAM PFA. Our exhibition thus features artworks from these museums, many of which have never before been exhibited at BAMFA. Two of our esteemed panelists, Ms. Demon and Ms. Howard, have artworks in the exhibition, as well as over 20 other artists, nearly all of whom are of African descent. Our exhibition title is borrowed from a featured artwork by local artist Raymond Saunders. We have adopted his language about things loved to make love a curatorial action. It is an experimental practice of selection, writing, design, programming, and installation that aims to support, care for, explore, and love Black life, communities, and artists.
Anti-Blackness in the museum can be both micro and macro acts, such as thefts of cultural objects, the appropriation of styles, the devaluation of skilled practices, and the marginalization and exclusion of Black artists from exhibitions and collections. Historically, museums have been implicated in anti-Black practices that present racial difference as a biological fact rather than a social construction. However, crucially, our exhibition does not intend to define Black art or to limit Black artists to a particular aesthetic. Rather, our exhibition is meant to follow in a legacy of non-traditional curatorial work that has tried to investigate and loosen the systems which have prioritized an identification of certain artists as Black artists rather than merely artists. Part of this work is to assume Blackness as the normative condition rather than the exception. As a class of predominantly non-Black students, we have been witnesses to such transgressions that can be considered institutional white supremacy. Recognizing the prevalence of anti-Blackness in the museum, our exhibition seeks to counter that by centering a diverse array of art by African-descended artists in the hope of addressing such questions as, to whom does Blackness belong? Where does Blackness belong? How can Blackness belong within the museum? And as theorist Fred Moten has written, can Blackness be loved? Thus, most of our research and labor for the exhibition sought to imagine ways that the museum can enact a practice of care and support for Black art, artists, and community.
As many of you are likely aware, exhibitions and programming such as our project are increasingly more frequent in museum spaces. This new visibility is possible because of decades of work and the dedicated careers of those that came before us. Our class continually returned to the scholarship, curatorial work, and artistic practice of today's panelists as a guide to a history of Black feminist-informed counterwork. It is to our delight that our panelists were free to join us today. We thank them immensely for making time for this event. We will now read selected biographies for each panelist. Unfortunately, as you may have noticed, Erica Demon will not be joining us today due to personal reasons. But Ms. Demon has been so thoughtful about her investment in this conversation and has graciously provided a written statement as well as brief responses to some of our questions. Patricia and I will be reading her statement and including some of her responses as part of our dialogue. Erica Demon was born in Nottingham, England, but now lives and works in San Francisco. In 2014, she earned a Bachelor of Fine Arts photography degree from the Academy of Art San Francisco. She was the recipient of the 2016 TOSA Award finalist, the 2015 Pro Arts 2x2 Solos Emerging Artists, and she also received the 2015 Working Artist Grant. She has had solo exhibitions here at the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive, and has been featured in domestic and international group exhibitions such as the New Orleans Museum of Art, Pier 24 Photography, and San Francisco Camera Works. Her works have been added to numerous permanent collections, not only here, but also the Museum of Contemporary Photography, Museum of Photographic Arts, New Orleans Museum of Arts, Perez Art Museum, and Pier 24. She is an active part of the San Francisco art community, partly through her studio space at Minnesota Street Projects, and her works are currently on view at Shalomit Nazarene Gallery in Los Angeles and the Perez Art Museum. Ms. Demon is a 2019 artist in residence at the Headland Center for the Arts.
Mildred Howard was born in San Francisco and raised in South Berkeley. She is well known for her sculptural installations and mixed media assemblage works. Ms. Howard received her MFA from the John F. Kennedy University in Orinda, California. In 2015, she received the Lee Krasner Award in recognition of a lifetime of artistic achievement. She has also been the recipient of the Nancy Graves Grant for Visual Artists and the Joan Mitchell Foundation Award, a fellowship at the California Arts Council, the Adeline Kent Award in San Francisco Art Institute, and most recently, the Honorary Doctorate of Fine Arts and the Douglas G. McGagey Distinguished Achievement Award at the San Francisco Art Institute. Ms. Howard's large-scale installations have been mounted at Creative Time in New York, Insight in San Diego, the National Museum of Women in the Arts, and the New Museum in New York. Public commissions and installations were executed for the Museum of Glass in Tacoma, Washington, the City of Oakland, the San Francisco Arts Commission, and International Airport. Ms. Howard's works are represented in the collections of SF MoMA, the D. Young Museum, the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive, of course, the Museum of Contemporary Art in San Diego, the Museum of Glass and Contemporary Art in Tacoma, the Oakland Museum, and the San Jose Museum of Art. The Ingram Gilbert Gallery has shown her work since 1990 and is also where one can support Ms. Howard. Currently, Ms. Howard's work is featured in an exhibition, Mildred Howard's Tap, Investigation of Memory at the Oakland Museum, California Art.
Dr. Bridget Cooks is Associate Professor in the Department of Art History and the Department of African American Studies at the University of California, Irvine. She is also core faculty in the PhD programs in Visual Studies and Culture and Theory and the Master's program in Critical and Curatorial Studies. Dr. Cooks earned her doctorate in the Visual and Cultural Studies program at the University of Rochester. She has received a number of awards, grants, and fellowships for her work, including the prestigious James A. Porter and David C. Driscoll Book Award in African American Art History. Dr. Cook's first career was as a museum professional. In this capacity, she worked at the Oakland Museum, the Smithsonian Institution, the National Gallery of Art, Washington, D.C., and the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. She has also helped curate several exhibitions, including The Art of Richard Mayhew at the Museum of the African Diaspora, San Francisco, as well as Grafton Tyler Brown Exploring California at the Pasadena Museum of California Art. She is the author of the book exhibiting Blackness, African Americans, and the American Art Museum, a truly phenomenal text that we've been referencing over and over again in our class. And she is currently working on her second manuscript titled A Dream Deferred, Art of the Civil Rights Movement and the Limits of Liberalism. She is currently curating the forthcoming exhibition, Ernie Barnes, a retrospective at the California African American Museum.
Naima J Keith recently concluded her 3-year tenure as Deputy Director and Chief Curator at the California African American Museum. There she curated several exhibitions, including Genevieve Goodnard's Smell the Roses, Kenyatta A.C. Hinkle, The Evanesced, and Gary Simmons' Fade to Black. She helped institute Cam Now, a series that prioritized conversations around political activism and radical self-care. Keith was the 2017 recipient of the David C. Driscoll Prize in recognition of her contributions to the field of African American art history and is currently co-artistic director of Prospect 5 in New Orleans in 2020. Between 2011 and 16, Ms. Keith served as associate curator at the Studio Museum in Harlem, where she organized and wrote publications for notable exhibitions including Rodney McMillan, Views of Main Street, Artist in Residence, Titus Kafar, and The Shadows Took Shape, co-curated by Zoe Whitley, 4, co-curated with Lauren Haynes and Thomas J. Lax. Her historical survey of Charles Gaines' grid work, 1974 to 1989, traveled to the Hammer Museum in spring of 2015 and was nominated in 2014 for Best Monographic Museum Show in New York, awarded by the International Association of Art Critics. Ms. Keith also held a curatorial position at the Hammer Museum, serving as the primary contact for the groundbreaking exhibition, Now Dig This, Art in Black Los Angeles, 1960s to 1980, organized by guest curator Dr. Kelly Jones. Ms. Keith holds degrees from Spelman College and UCLA and is a proud native of Los Angeles. Most recently, she started her new position at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art this week, so we really thank her for coming. And her position there is Vice President of Education and Public Programs. So these people have fantastic careers. Throughout all of your illustrious careers, you have modeled and imagined new and better futures for the art world, and we are in debt to your labor.
To give everyone an outline for the format of this discussion, Patricia and I will pose our first question now, for which the panelists have prepared brief remarks of about 7 minutes. Then we will go into a dialogue between ourselves and the panelists before opening it up to questions from the audience. We would appreciate it if everyone held their comments and questions until we ask you to participate at the end. We will now take our seats and move into our first question. Excuse me.
Our panel takes its title, Ethics.
I think it's not on.
Hello?
I think you have to literally they were saying.
Hello.
Yep.
Right here? Y'all hear me? Yeah? Okay. Our panel takes its title, Ethics of Care, from cultural theorist Patricia Hill Collins, who outlines 3 components of the term as value placed on individual expressiveness, the appropriateness of emotions, and the capacity for empathy, all of which she argues are prominent amongst the Black community.
This central concept within Black feminist thought has thus framed our exhibition. Okay. We are foregrounding an ethics of care as a critical means of transforming this museum into a site that can practice love of and for Blackness. We thus conclude this very long introduction by posing our first question to the panelists. How do you define care in regards to your museum work and art practice in an anti-Black world? Dr. Cooks, we welcome you to initiate this conversation.
Okay, I know you can hear me, right? Okay. So I have something prepared to show with some slides as a way of answering this question. So we're going to look at some images, and I'm going to say some things. I want to thank Lee Rayford. I want to thank Sherry Goodman, Lauren Kreutz, Patricia, Delphine, and Sean Carson, also, who helped me with the logistics of getting on Southwest Airlines to be here. So I appreciate all of that. Okay, so here's what I've titled my presentation. on abstraction, anti-Blackness, and self-care. And we're going to talk about an artist and curator and gallerist named Peter Bradley. How many people have heard of Peter Bradley before? Okay, that's like 7 people, just curious. In fact, can we go, or do you want me to do it? I won't have to give you something else to do. Okay, so here's Peter Bradley. This is a recent photo of him. He insisted that I show this to you. He loves this picture of himself, so I told him that I would definitely show it. In fact, I have it in here twice. And this is from an article that came out just last year called "Why Have There Been No Great Black Dealers?" And so, provocative title, also an untrue title, but a way to sort of bring him into people's awareness of one of his roles in the art world. So I wanted to talk about the case of Peter Bradley because it's a very interesting story, and I am going to keep this in 7 minutes. Okay, so Peter Bradley is still alive. He is a painter who paints every day. He was also a gallerist and a curator, and he was always very focused on abstraction. And in the 1970s, he made a series of abstract paintings and sculptures, and he saw this as an opportunity to express himself freely, the way that he wanted to, and outside of the expectations, particularly by other Black artists who were heavily invested in the Black arts movement, to be doing what they thought Black artists should be doing, okay? Now, he's an abstractionist, and he's very decided about that. I just want to tell a brief, fascinating story. In 1970, he was asked by a white artist who's very well known named Larry Rivers to participate to an exhibition that he was curating at Rice University called Some American History. And Larry Rivers had gone to different African nations in 1967 and had decided that he was Black. He felt Black, and he decided he was Black. So he was going to have an exhibition about being Black. And the exhibition had different titles. My Black Experience was one, The Black Experience was another, and finally, with the help of his patron, John de Menil of the Menil Collection, he came up with Some American History. He wanted to have this exhibition of all of his work only, and then Menil convinced him that he should maybe have some actual Black people who were artists contribute to the show. And so he reached out to Bradley, and he asked Bradley to make an artwork and name it after an important Black historical figure, which was what Peter was already doing. So Peter made this work as an abstract sculpture called Marcus Garvey, and he shipped it off to Houston. He wasn't invited to the exhibition. He wasn't told the premise of the exhibition. He wasn't told the name of the exhibition. And then sometime later, he acquired a photograph of his work as it looked in the exhibition, and it looked like this. He was very upset because when it left his studio, there were no papers of photographs of Marcus Garvey on it. But when the work went to Houston, Rivers saw it and decided it wasn't Black enough, that's my words, and so he made these photocopies of 2 different photographs of Marcus Garvey and decided to paste them onto the sculpture. Okay, so Rivers was very upset, and as he tells the story, Bradley was very upset at Rivers. Bradley goes to Larry Rivers' studio, Larry opens the door, and Peter punches him in the mouth. So this is one way to deal with anti-Blackness in the art world. Okay, and it is. I mean, I think it's helpful to think about how angry he was and how angry any of us would be to have submitted your work, and it's totally unethical for someone to do that. And to be treated in that way. Part of the lesson, though, and what I'm going to next, is that it didn't stop Peter from making work, right? That he continued to do what he wanted to do in the way he wanted to do it. He continued to make paintings, and I'll show you some of these. This is called hemming. Okay, this is from 1971. And this is an example of the kind of work that he was making at this time, wholly abstract, I would say even spacey, colorful, saturated pastels, dreamy paintings that are titled after historical Black figures. So we think about Heming, we think about Sally Hemings, and he got the spelling of the name wrong, but that's the association that he's making. An enormous painting, 9 by 7 feet. Okay, so making work, and here's Sally Hemings. This is not by Peter Bradley. I just put this in here to remind us of the historical figure. This is a painting based on a drawing of her. But this is, a surface of wonder. The title brings the option to us as viewers of considering historical memory of this enslaved woman who was owned by Thomas Jefferson, the irony of him being one of the main authors of the Declaration of Independence, founding a nation on freedom, and then enslaving a number of people. Another example, this is the work that's going to be in the exhibition that has brought us all together today. This is named Ism Dart, number 1. This is from 1972. And this is Ism Dart, also known as Ned Huddleston. He was born in 1949 in Arkansas. He was enslaved. And he worked taking care of Confederate soldiers during the Civil War. And then after the Civil War, he lived in Texas and Mexico. And he was a hustler. He was a gambler. He was also, now this is going to rhyme, a rustler. He was a cattle rustler and a horse rustler. He used to steal people's livestock and then sell them to other people. And he was murdered for that in 1900. So he's a Black cowboy, and a name that has been lost to history for many people. And what Peter has been doing, or what he was doing in the 70s, is kind of bringing together a sense of freedom, his own artistic freedom, but also bringing an opportunity to consider historical figures and think about them in relationship to freedom that they didn't have. Also thinking about the limitations that are put on Black artists in terms of the kind of work they're allowed to make and the limitations of being Black in America now. So we can think about this in any number of ways, which I'm happy to do because I'm sure my time is almost up. But to also think about self-care as a practice of validating your vision, validating your experience, validating your ancestors, right? Making sure that you're putting the names of these historical figures in our mouths today, to make that part of the way we think about our context and our history. So I have more slides, but I'm going to stop there. And hand them, no, and you have your own mic. I'm going to pass the time to Naima.
Okay, perfect. I can't remember the question. Could you reread the question?
How do you define care in regards to your museum work and art practice in an anti-Black world?
Well, I don't work in a museum, number one. And so I think if it were not for artists, then there wouldn't be curators and directors and all of that. So I only work with people who I can do what I want to do. So that's my opinion. And early on, I found different ways of showing my work. Let's see if you could keep going. This was the opening of the De Young when it was remodeled, I guess, 10 years ago, maybe 12 years ago. But it wasn't in the museum, it was in the Botanical Gardens, which I thought was a better place for this work. This is a mirrored house where when you enter, there are areas of infinity. In the garden, there were bottles stuck down. Those bottles were originally done at CAM. I did a garden there where the bottles were stuck down with a phrase of James Weldon Johnson. So most of my work addresses both contemporary and historical things. So if you're standing in the present time, but you're also experiencing history, because what is time? I mean, it's continuously moving. A few of my houses, I also do smaller houses. I've been doing these because houses hold memories, and they're containers, they're vessels, they're everyday objects. What happens when you take an object and begin to use it over and over? It takes on all these different meanings. It conjures up all these ideas and questions, how light reflects, how it refracts. I did a larger version of this in about 4 or 5 years ago. And this one originally, this is supposed to be my last house that I'm going to make, the smaller one. Yeah, I did a larger one like this, but this is the last one I'll probably make. Blackbird in a Red Sky, AKA Fall of the Blood House, was done at the opening of the Tacoma Museum in Washington. And oftentimes people think that home is a safe place where it really isn't always a safe place. And this pays tribute to that. But when I did it, I didn't think about Adam and Eve when I did the apples. But when you're working, you may have one thing in mind, but as you continue to work, other things come up, because I don't think Eve would have bit the apple if she knew this would be such a hot mess in the world right now. When you stand inside the house, you see Mount Rainier. And when you look at the red apples through the red house, you see how the color slightly drops out and puts a cell. It's like being in a dark, well, do you guys know what dark rooms are? Yeah, being in a dark room and you have that red light. But the apples are sort of a silvery color. And when you go outside, how the angle of the light hits on the apples casts these rainbow images in the water. This piece will be in New York in 2020. Oh, there I am when my hair was black. Abode Sanctuary for the Familiar was first commissioned by Insight 94 in San Diego that dealt with the relationship between Mexico and the United States. And interestingly now, how that relationship has shifted with the current dictator in the White House. When you, blue was a predominant color that I've recognized when I first went to Mexico. And so blue and gold represent California. This piece was also a memorial to my son. Inside of the house was maybe 30 dozen yellow roses. And they've put it up several times at the Oakland Museum. This is how things get shifted. But they didn't include the entire place, they included the house. So that changes the experience. The fence goes around it and you walk around the fence and enter it into a different kind of way. So you're sort of enveloped in this atmosphere, in this house, in this place. Oh, that's the roof. In my very first battle house, some of you may have seen this if you were at the Oakland Museum. This is the one, and I'll repeat it, that I went around trying to collect enough bottles, like 4,000, And when I got to 2,000, I found a place where you can get them where the labels are already off. And each bottle weighs 1.25 pounds. They're 4,000. They were lifted at least 4 times. So, yeah. Which brings me to Safe House. And Safe House was originally, Lizetta LaFall Collins curated one of the inaugural exhibitions for the Museum of the African Diaspora. And I was one of the artists, and this piece was originally commissioned for that. And I took, I don't know, I think I was reading somewhere where silver objects, the companies who made silver objects also made shackles. So I decided to collect all these silver objects and place them on the floor of a house made out of knives. And the silver objects go from polished to tarnished as you walk up the walkway, and then there are knives stuck on the wall. And why is it that we place so much emphasis on how precious these items are? How can they be more precious than human? I mean, they're just things. Some of them are crushed. I took them to an automobile place to have them crushed. And some are just as they would be if they were used in your house. So it's also about domesticity. And as you walk to the house, through the house or around it, there you see that, the detail of the objects. And most of us have seen this. And then some people, they're in china cabinets, and you never even use them. And then knives stuck in the, I heard a story once about this young woman. I think she was like a teenager, and she was being molested by a brother-in-law, and she pretended that she had passed out, and it scared him, and she was smart enough to do that. She went down into the kitchen, she said, and took a knife and threw it in the wall, and it stuck in the wall. That's why I have this piece. It's based on partly that story. So there are all these, they're not like the whole knife. I cut them off and stuck them in the wall. We were supposed to take this one out. This is one of my public pieces that I did in the library, and it's palindromic letters. And there are 11 in the alphabet. And it separates the reading room or the room for children from the other parts of the library. So I imagine kids trying to make up words with those letters. This is in the Sacramento airport, or if they haven't taken it down. What happens is that I looked up historical letters about during the gold rush. And those letters were so racist and sexist. So I took fragments of those letters and blew it up so that they were abstract. And what you see are, let's see, like there. Those are mirrored images. So you're standing in the now, but looking at yourself through the mirrors and outside all at the same time. Oops. And this is my last bottle house. It's now at Xavier University with 97 bottles. And I did it in the shape of the M because I wanted to remind myself that it's my last bottle house. Unless somebody's gonna pay me a whole lot of money, and I might change my mind. So, yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I just want to echo Bridget's thanks to both the organizers, to our two moderators this afternoon. Thank you for being so patient with me. As they mentioned, I just concluded my first week in my new position at LACMA. It's a very big department, and the first week is always kind of a little bit of a whirlwind. And so, just thank you again for being so patient with me, and then we're helping to organize the slides this afternoon. I think it's a really interesting. Oh, can everyone hear me? Emily, can you hear me? Okay. I've been thinking a lot about this question of care because it's actually something I don't feel like we talk about very often as it relates to not only just our own museum work, but then how we're thinking about the museum space. And so it was a great opportunity to really take some time to think about that. A show I wanted to start with is actually with Kenyatta Hinkle, which I think you have an image of. So Kenyatta is a Bay Area-based artist who I think is going to be in your exhibition opening May 14th. Oh, okay, sorry. So she's not going to be. Sorry, she's not going to be in this exhibition. But she. Okay. Okay. You have plenty of opportunity to see her work if you have not already. But Kenyatta and I have actually known each other for quite some time. She was included in the F show, or the 4 exhibition that I did while I was at Student Museum in Harlem. And we actually met when she was still in grad school at Cal Arts, and we've just remained friends ever since. But when I first got to CAM, I immediately reached out to Kenyatta because I just wanted to kind of catch up with her and talk about what she had been working on. And she told me about a series of drawings that she had done about, a serial killer who his nickname is the Grim Sleeper. And I was like, okay, wow, Kenyatta. So this is interesting lunch conversation. But there's a film actually about the Grim Sleeper that had come out on HBO because 2 very kind of like novice documentarians kind of just basically went down to South LA to better understand how this serial killer was able to kill upwards of 30 plus women, African American women, in Los Angeles without being apprehended or captured. And so these 2 documentary filmmakers literally just kind of took their camera, Caucasian gentlemen, kind of took their cameras down to the hood and just kind of interviewed as many people as they could to kind of understand basically the culture that could have allowed, both in terms of from a police perspective, but then also the community, to understand kind of how he was able to get away with these crimes. And what you see throughout the film is fascinating because it's this evolution of, people saying he couldn't have, I didn't think that was, that was my neighbor and he fixed cars and that was the homie and, that kind of thing all the way until, well, he was kind of creepy and he did have photographs and I did kind of see blood in his car. I mean, it was like it was just the evolution of thinking, but it was just this idea of not really believing that there could be African-American serial killers was kind of part of it. But where Kenyatta wanted to focus was really on the women that were killed and realizing that police had not fully investigated this crime for a very long time because a lot of the women were either prostitutes or just women that the police believed or deemed to be unworthy of investigation. And like I said, it wasn't until this film and then also a group that was very active in Los Angeles called like Moms Against Serial Killers that actually brought him to justice. And so it was a kind of a longer story, like I said, than this film. But the work that she created actually, while on some level was about these women, it did not depict them realistically, right? So each painting wasn't necessarily about, okay, Keisha so-and-so that was killed or another woman. It was just like the female form. And so you have one image here of 3 works, but there's another side or another wall that actually has 100 kind of small drawings that Kenyatta created for the exhibition. And I wanted to open with talking about this show, 1, because of the subject matter, but 2, because I think the amount of care that Kenyatta and I took to really think about how we framed the exhibition. We had a lot of conversation just about how much information about the Grim Sleeper we were going to include in the text. We mentioned the Grim Sleeper in the wall text, for example. We talk like maybe 2 sentences about the story, but we didn't want to go too far into the story because, again, while on some level that the drawings were inspired by the story, the images weren't of those women, and so there was a concern that basically the reading of the work would only be seen through the lens of the grim sleeper, because he's a serial killer, and not really appreciating the way in which Kenyatta rendered the work, that she made all of her own tools and brushes to create the paintings, that it was really about motherhood and womanhood and the invisibility of Black women, because we all know there are thousands of crimes that are currently under investigated because they're women of color, and so this idea of care and thinking about, especially with African American artists, how the work is framed and how the work is discussed with the public, is something that I've really committed, I think, my career to, in terms of, again, wanting people to have insight or to have an understanding of why the artist created the work, but again, not closing off the possibility of seeing beyond that subject matter, right? Because far too often, African American artists are read through the lens of race, or read through the lens of a particular subject, and even though they may be touching on those subjects, the idea that, oftentimes that's only the way that people are seen. So to give another example, not a show that I've curated per se, but, when you read a lot of interviews with Mark Bradford, for example, or in my conversations with him as well, talking about how a lot of the rhetoric was about the fact that he was a former hairdresser, that he uses M papers because he's a hairdresser, and just kind of like really kind of foreclosing the opportunity to really think about the beauty and the texture and the depth of the work. And so with Kenyatta, like I said, I think we thought a lot about the fact that this show was going to be at the California African American Museum, that it was going to be in a safe space, right? In a space that, while obviously there are not just African American viewers coming to the museum, but the idea that it was the kind of museum that I think could appreciate and really give the space for thinking about this sensitive subject matter. Again, we really wanted to think about, like I said, how we were talking about these women, right? That none of the women are named, for example. Every work is pretty much untitled. None of the figures are rendered in a way you could recognize anyone, because they're not, again, about the actual women. So again, I wanted to kind of start by thinking about this exhibition, because it really was that opportunity to kind of think about care in a museum sense, right? And how you care for both the artist and what they want to do, but also care for the subject matter. And how that could kind of take on many different forms. Again, in this case, because it's sensitive subject matter, but again, also wanting to have care for the medium itself and just the objects. And so, I don't know, it was a really kind of interesting moment, I think, for me as a curator, because, oftentimes you're concerned about how a visitor or, is going to interpret an exhibition, right? And you want to kind of think as expansively about a show as possible, but also you want to kind of lead visitors on a journey, right, through an exhibition, so they can understand kind of your thesis for the exhibition. But again, how do you do so in a way, again, that doesn't foreclose any opportunity for deeper readings? So this was one of the shows that I organized while at CAM. And then, thinking about, care more broadly, not necessarily just for exhibitions, but also in the institution itself. So, I arrived at CAM in 2016. My title there was Deputy Director and Chief Curator. My kind of mandate, if you will, was to take the museum in much more of a contemporary direction and really kind of expand the kind of reach of the museum. I really thought initially that my role was really just going to be focused on exhibitions, but I quickly realized that there are kind of a whole host of things that could evolve. And so, very early on, there was everything from like changing the front desk to changing the website to changing social media to, because I oversaw all those things, but there was also really a lot of thought into the openings for the exhibitions. Most of my friends, while they may go to museum openings or museums to support me, they may not necessarily go normal. They might not just go on a regular Saturday. They don't necessarily see it as a space that welcomes them, as a space that they feel invited in to. And so one of the first things I did was change kind of the opening structure of the opening celebration at CAM. And so changing it to celebrating individual exhibitions to then changing them to per season. And we called the openings Can't Stop, Won't Stop. We actually just had, my last Can't Stop, Won't Stop was a few weeks ago, celebrating the opening of Lee's exhibition, Plumb Line, Charles White and the Contemporary, as well as many other exhibitions. But the openings, are, like I said, celebrate more than one exhibition at a time. There are, multiple DJs, there's food trucks, but the way in which we market the, I gotta stop saying we. The way in which CAM, Mark, because I don't work there anymore, the way in which CAM markets the openings are, again, really just a celebration of the arts and about culture. And so you often find people are much more welcome to the space because they don't feel as if they have to know about the work on view, right? I find that, oftentimes people feel as if like, oh, if I don't know this particular artist or if I don't have a way in, then I'm not welcome, right? Or I don't feel a part of the conversation. And so for us, it was about kind of opening up that conversation. And so now we have, 1,500, 2,000 people per opening, that, there's dancing outside and the whole 9 yards. But for me, it was really about opening up the space. And I think, not to keep playing on this word of care, but since that's kind of the theme of the question, care for the audience, right? And not expecting them to know everything about an artist or to, position the show as like the, yes, that's the thing you're coming to, and yes, that's what you're celebrating, but allowing the space for discovery, right? Allowing for the space of, like just coming in with an open mind, right? And not having the pressure of like, oh God, I have to say something intelligent, or I have to like ask the artist a question, or I have to know something. And so really kind of thinking about the openings as a safe space for that kind of discovery. And like I said, coming for a food truck and then you discover this exhibition, or, coming for this DJ and then you do this. So I think that model has really kind of opened up the conversation in a way where I have found that people really respect the fact that, and like I said, feel less pressure to know about a particular thing. We also concluded, I was saying we, but CAM, one of the things I started when I got there was a year-long series called Activism Now. And in a lot of ways, it was in response to the political climate. Trump had just been elected, and I think many of us were in shock and trying to figure out what does activism look like in the 21st century? What does it mean when you're online, offline? It felt like everybody's voting, but Trump still got elected. I think that was an opportunity to invite activists from all over the country of all different generations to come to the museum to talk about what activism looks like now. And I think that was a fantastic series. And then the next year, we did a series called Radical SelfCare. Now, I'll have now in the title. So Radical SelfCare Now. And that, was really just a series about care, really, radical self-care. And we included the word radical in the title because for, oftentimes for people of color, the idea of taking time out for oneself or from, stepping out of the fray or thinking about how to take better care of oneself is a radical act. Right, the idea that you're placing yourself beyond kind of the fray, and especially as I'm a mother of 2 children, so especially as a mom, sometimes you feel like you have to always be on. And so we titled the series Radical Self-Care and kind of explored everything from meditation to eating to yoga in the museum to, all different. And we actually ended with actor Terry Crews talking about toxic masculinity. As well, and so it was a wonderful series I think to think about how care should be a priority, especially for communities of color. And so this idea that you can, that CAM could be that space to talk about those kinds of things was the priority for that season or for that year. Now, actually, there's a series called After the Hashtag, which is completely different. It's my own kind of selfish interest in what happens after something goes viral. Black Lives Matter is celebrating its own anniversary, and a number of hashtags. I'm just kind of curious on, when something goes viral, like what was that, Barbecue Becky, and all these other, hashtags. Kind of like what happens, like what actual legislation comes about, not for Backyard Becky, but like for Black Lives Matter. I'm just kind of curious on what does social media activism look like today. But again, I think that the Radical Self-Care series was really popular because I think seeing the museum as a safe space, right? Seeing the museum as a space that you could go to for care was something that we also wanted to think about more seriously. So those are just some of the examples in which I've tried to, in my own kind of curatorial work, when thinking about how one kind of looks at artists and talks about artists, not only in terms of like how one describes a show, but also thinking about equity in the museum, pay, all those things we can talk about at a later time, and then also through my public programming work through series like Radical SelfCare Now and Activism Now and those kinds of things.
Thank you all so much. So because Erica Demon isn't here today, I will be reading her response. And she's also provided a few images. I'll skip her thank yous for me and Patricia. I think about care at the core of our whole existence, and it begins with ourselves. How well do we nurture our bodies and minds in the world, an anti-Black world? How do we even begin to do that? How do we care and find safe spaces for each other? How do we protect ourselves and others who may feel threatened, minimized, erased, and under-supported? I think about these questions and more on a daily basis in my practice. My practice is focused on photographic portraiture, and my 2 bodies of work to date have focused on elevating the African diaspora, counteracting and subverting historical portrayals, in particular the mugshot and the reading of the face physiognomy. I wanted to talk more about Untitled 08, A Portrait of Jamaica, which will be on view in our show after May 17th, and touch upon the project as a whole and where I find myself within it. I'd been making Silhouettes, which is the series you see here, midway through my 2nd year in school, a year and a half into moving to the United States. The project manifested itself in a way that so many of my ideas do during a time of physical and mental transformation. I began to notice a shift in the way I was feeling about myself, unheard, unseen, and dispossessed. This shift coincided with a desire to create work exclusively with people from the African diaspora. I needed to understand that the gaze, my gaze, was different than that of the aggressive landscape I lived in. The studio became a safe space for ideas and learning together with and from the people I photographed. We shared our stories, our individuality, our community, and our voices. A community of Black women grew organically from this work. We were Black women in the studio space, and our voices and experiences could not be challenged. Our appearance could not be challenged, our being could not be challenged, our beauty could not be challenged. The work grew in many ways, as did a greater access to the people whom I made photographs with. There were women that I directly approached on the streets of San Francisco. I asked my friends in my photography course, and they would share the project with their friends and pass on phone numbers and email addresses. As my connection to the Black art world deepened, my community of women grew. I placed numerous ads on Craigslist using my own silhouette as an example of the work in the Women Looking for Women section. There are some beautiful moments that blossomed friendships. I especially enjoyed the resonance of people in the studio space, amplifications of joy and nourishment, which have continued in time. Moving to the United States has definitely molded and changed perceptions of my own identity and self-definition. I wanted to understand myself on a different and deeper level, different and deeper to the person I knew myself to be in the UK. Silhouette strengthened my whole being at a difficult time of navigating microaggressions and anti-Black attitudes. My time with Jamaica. We recently exchanged a few emails specifically about our time together in the studio when I learned I would be talking on the panel. I made brief notes on the day of the shoot, but it had been some time since we had been in contact. I remembered that she is from Barbados and had moved back there post-graduation. She attended my school, but was a student on the master's program whilst I was on the BFA course. Our paths had not crossed until the day we had met in the common area of the studio building, but after that, we never missed each other. She had been making photography for longer than I had and was keenly interested in the beauty and fashion side of creating. With my background in advertising, I was adamant in avoiding the world again. It was early on a Saturday morning. I was setting up the studio for Kira. Kira had responded to my ad on Craigslist, and I was planning to be at the studio at 11 a.m. Kira is featured in some of the other images from the Silhouette series. I find it meditative setting up photography lights and preparing the space before making my work. I often do this alone, not because it is easier, to the contrary, but because I can prepare myself and the space for the energy of the photographic exchange. I can create a space of calm inside and out. I am clearing my energy to make room to receive and exchange energy. Once I completed the light and camera setup, I had a lot of time to spare, so I thought I would see what was happening in the rest of the building. When I walked out of the studio, I saw Jamaica waiting in the mat cutting area. I immediately wanted to photograph her. It takes courage to ask, share, and make work with another person, especially a stranger. There is a part of myself that I share in order to create the work I do. That can be daunting, exhilarating, and rewarding. I believe you cannot make portraits in any other way. The energy flows in both reciprocal directions. This is care flowing in both directions. Jamaica was intrigued by my shooting style, using the film camera and not having a big team of hair and beauty artists. We talked the technical and geeked out for a bit. One note I wrote simply said, the diaspora. With my mom being from Jamaica, we chatted about the Caribbean, her time and experiences there, how I had yet to visit Jamaica, and about my family's migration to Great Britain in the 1960s. There are so many tender and delicate points of reference in her photograph, the light caressing her skin and producing a result never intended for the calibrated tones, deliberately intended for pink. The bra straps that have dug into her chest and the goose pimples that sit in unison, the curve of her lower lip as it moves into her chin, her immaculate posture. It makes me sit up whenever I see her. The curve of her hair, the color on the tips confirming that the photograph is color and not black and white. There is a calm about her pose, yet I also see her strength. The visual metaphor of the shadow and the highlight make me understand that I can never see her true depth within the medium, and I think that satisfies me most. So thank you to Erica. This is not the final work that she was referencing, but this was a different piece in the Silhouette series. And Patricia, would you like to ask the next question?
I really wanted to thank you, Ms. Keith, for talking about audiences, and that actually is a perfect segue into our next question, is thinking about some of the strategies that are used to remake or shift the gallery space to make people feel more welcome. So we would like to ask Dr. Cooks to maybe talk about some curatorial experiments that maybe you've thought about or used in the past or have been thinking about, and if you'd like to say something more about the ways that you think about audience when putting up a show. And looking at your works, Mildred, some of them are outside of the gallery space and museum space and go in the garden, or like, what are some of the ways in you thinking about that the gallery might not be capacious enough for the work itself? That can be in any order.
Okay. I feel like Naima is the queen of super cool things that happen at museums to get people to feel welcome and excited about being there. I would say that, yeah, the exhibitions that I've done, I suppose, are more traditional and less experimental. So I do try to, as Naima said, you want to tell a story, but not make it so didactic and allow people to have their own sense of discovery. With the exhibition of Richard Mayhew's work, who's an elder, he just turned 95 on Monday. African-American I would say psychedelic landscape painter. I mean, they are very bright paintings that he makes from memory, and he has a palette that is sort of informed in such a way that you get these kind of what he calls emotional landscapes, so that looking at each one has a certain mood, and he wants you to feel that mood more than actually feeling like you're in that space. He's interested in color theory and that impact in your psyche. So I would say with work like that, I want it to give it as much space as possible for people to be able to have their own experiences with work. And I did show a portrait of him immediately when you walk in, but then when you would turn, you had just a whole field of different experiences, and it was up to you to go in whatever order you wanted to. So I'd say just setting up spaces of discovery where people are excited to, maybe they'll see some things that are familiar, but moving through that to have some new kind of experiences. Because that's what I love about art. I don't want to be told, everything. I want to have some label, so if I want to know more, I can find out more. And, artists who are painters often do all kinds of other things. Artists that are sculptors or installation artists have all kinds of different, they work in print, sometimes they're singers, sometimes they're I want to know all of that. I want someone to do the research for me, and then to have an exhibition where they can discover new things. So,
to be honest, I don't necessarily know if I've taken that many curatorial risks. For me, the risk taking that, let me say that, I want to take risks but still maintain the artistic integrity of the work, right? So I don't want to compromise the artist's vision at all. Obviously the accommodations have to be made for the museum space, but I mean, in terms of taking any kind of significant risks, I don't necessarily know if I've done that. I mean, I think, go ahead.
I'll just give a quick context. Like, one of the things that came up for us was just simply the wall color, and how, Rene de Souza's book called White Walling, and just thinking about how white walls are always the standard for galleries. And that was just one thing that created months of discussion for us. And it didn't feel like a big risk, but, it kind of caused a lot of kind of concern and debate. So,
well, what's interesting is funny because we were just talking about Bridget's show that's coming up at CAM, and obviously I know I don't work there anymore, but I was like, so what are you thinking about? Because she said I just did a walkthrough with our exhibitions manager, and she was thinking about wall color, and I was like, you're not going to go too many wall colors, right? Some art, of course, once a chief curator, always a chief curator, but that question about wall color, and sometimes how you can kind of go a little too overboard, especially when you have subject matter that people really think that the way to highlight that is through wall color. And it's not to say that I've used wall color in my shows. It's not that I'm, a white wall only kind of girl, but I'm saying sometimes the wall color can conflict with or, take away from the beauty and the, like I said, the depth of the work. And so, yes, I think wall color can certainly add to an experience of an exhibition, and certainly highlight certain things about the show that you want to really call audience's attention to. But sometimes it can compromise, I think. And sometimes when I see like too many colors, or you're just like, okay, why? Or, because we're doing an African art exhibition, you're doing like the earth tones. Like that, I hate that. Like I really, so now, again, I'm not saying white wall. I think there are ways to create environments that don't require 15 different colors. Yeah. So I think that, yes, I think that white walls can sometimes make a space feel a bit more sterile. I think it's also a little bit of restraint to say, you know what, that sometimes subtle shifts in a wall color or the way in which you think about, so it's like literally we were just talking about that 10 minutes ago, or right before we got on stage, where I was like, so you're only thinking about
Yeah, and I was thinking about, because Ernie Barnes, who people will know him, if you ever watch the TV show Good Times, he has these elongated figures who are dancing in this painting called Sugar Shack. And I thought all of his paintings are figurative. All of them are black people that are about the same color. And I did think about what colors would look good with brown skin. There's lots of colors that look great with it. But, I was thinking about in terms of content, plus a lot of the colors that he uses in addition to brown are very bright. So I don't want the wall colors trying to compete. And it's like, well, let's have red walls. It's like, no, let's, we're not trying to compete with the painting. Let's have the paintings have their energy. And white, I thought, against the bright would be too drastic. And but I was thinking about brown skin, and so it's like we're using a warm sand color that's actually called cookie dough. That's the official color of the show, yeah.
This is an interesting topic, because as an artist, objects don't feel. Paintings don't have feeling. They're all inanimate objects. They don't give a shit. Do you know what I mean?
I do, yeah.
They really don't. The paintings they don't have feelings. It is what the audience, what the spectator brings to the work. As an artist, my object is to try to make every piece the best I can. And so I go back and forth from being the spectator to the maker. But that glass doesn't have any feelings. That's the way I see it as an artist.
I don't think they have feelings either, but
if the work engages one in some kind of way, then you've done your job. It has to engage you. Ask questions, you step back, you look at it again, and it may not come right away. It may come later.
Thinking about creating a relationship for the spectator, what are some of the ways in which you enter a space and you have to make decisions kind of on the spot about how you're going to lay out your work or an installation? Like, what are some of the things that come to mind when you first enter into the gallery space?
Well, the space itself, the shape of the space, whether it's inside or outside, what is it that will draw that person to enter the house? How do you make that happen? And what I don't always think about that. I think about how will this work formally? Should I put this bottle this way or turn it another way? That's the way I'm looking at it. And then afterward, then how it's placed. Okay, so I want them to enter in this way, but someone may enter a whole nother way and then bring a whole nother idea. And I'm thinking, wow, I didn't think about that. When I did my first bottle house, and it was at the Headland Center for the Arts, and I didn't know that empty bottles was a metaphor for dead soldiers. And here I was at a former military base. So the audience informed me about something I didn't know. But the bottle is just a bottle. It's what the ideas that are evoked as a result of that bottle.
Just to follow up briefly, Ms. Howard, I wonder if you take a certain delight or pleasure in putting a knife into the gallery wall.
Well, at that point, it was like, oh God, how many did I get? Do I have to put any more? But so I didn't really think about it because sometimes art is like labor. You're working. At least for me, it is. It's not always just, oh, I'm just so great and this is so much fun. It's not always that way. It's everything. But yeah, that was a great thing to do.
I wanted to ask a question about moving beyond the museum space. Ms. Keith, you touched on public programming and even...
You can call me Naima, it's fine, really.
Thank you. And you brought up the hashtag, so I wanted to think a little bit about care as accessibility. As museums are increasingly trying to use social media, move beyond the gallery space. Tumblr was so important for a number of people, or many, millions of people in my generation. So maybe the way that you all are thinking about using your artworks or your curatorial practice in a digital sphere as a practice of care and accessibility. And one thing I'll note to the audience is that one of the critical and important shows that Naima worked on, Now Dig This, is an exhibition archive online at the Hammer Museum, which is so important for those of us that don't have the funds to travel to see these exhibitions.
Okay, so the question, but yes, so thank you for plugging Now Dig This. Yes, the entire exhibition is online, as well as a number of the texts about the artists, interviews, public programs, the entire literally the entire show is online. And then a number of the oral histories with the artists are actually housed at the Getty. So for those that are interested in reading more about a number of the artists that were in the show, the Getty has the full kind of transcript there. And then the Getty recently launched their African American Art Initiative, which I know Bridget is on the committee for. They recently hired an associate curator, and that initiative is going to be devoted to digitizing collections and artists' archives over the next, 3 years? Next several years. And so I know Bridget just interviewed Charles Gaines and a number of other people. So I would definitely keep your eye out for the developments happening at the Getty. But in terms of thinking about self-care, I guess outside in a digital sphere, or
There's
care.
accessibility. Yeah.
As accessibility. So I'll actually answer that two ways. One is for me personally, and then me as, I guess, a curator. For accessibility and care, on my own Instagram page, my own Instagram feed, I'm actually very honest about, well, maybe not too honest, but I'm honest to a certain extent about the fact that I am a working mother. I have an amazing husband, and we, we raise our children together. But just the idea that I do have kids. My husband and I learned that we were pregnant with our daughter, who's now 3. I remember being so afraid to tell Thelma, that my boss, Thelma Golden at the time, because I was at the Student Museum in Harlem, I remember being so afraid to tell Thelma that I was pregnant. Not because I thought she was going to do anything. I mean, Thelma's an amazing boss and very supportive, but I also just didn't know how she was going to react. And a number of my mentors don't have kids, right? So Thelma doesn't have kids, Lowry Stokes Sims does not have kids. A lot of curators don't have kids, and so I honestly did not know what she was going to say, but also because there had been conversation amongst many curators my age that we were fearful that having kids would mean that our careers would drastically change, right? That we wouldn't be given the same opportunities, that we wouldn't be considered for promotions, that when you're thinking about donor trips, that they would say, oh, Naima can't do it because she has a kid. They wouldn't allow me to make the decision, but rather, that decision would be made for me because of me having children. And so, I've kind of made it a point to be a lot more vocal, I think, on my Instagram page about the fact that I have kids and that I do balance, both things. And I put, for example, a very embarrassing photo of me with my mouth hanging open on a plane because I took my son to New York when he was 6 months old. My mom and I went to New York, and we took him because I had to go. And so there's a picture of me flying, my mom took as a joke, that my mom took of me because I just looked crazy. But I decided to post it because I wanted people to see that this is what real life looks like, right? So I could have just jumped off the plane and try to post a cute picture, but the reality was that sometimes I have to juggle all these things at one time, and I wanted other curators to see that it requires work, but it's possible, right? So there's both the accessibility and care that and the idea that putting out there that having this life is possible with kids, but it does require prioritizing it. I do have to scale back, and I can't do everything, and all these things. So that's one part of it. But in terms of how I think about with my shows, or even thinking about the museum, I'll talk about CAM because I've only been at LACMA for a week, so I can't necessarily talk about LACMA yet. But in terms of with CAM, we thought a lot about doing a lot more digital videos about just going to the museum. And so we did a whole series called How Do You Get to CAM? And one, because a lot of people didn't realize where CAM was. So we were like, oh, we're right across from USC, and then it'd be like, but it was always in relation to USC. And so CAM is kind of similar to where it is in terms of where Berkeley, and right there. And so we did a whole series of videos with different people. One, featuring 4 young people taking an Uber, another guy, riding his bike, another family, so all short videos are meant to be put on Instagram, but the idea is that, that it's an easy, short ride. I mean, that was kind of the quick message, but the idea is that kind of seeing yourself in that. And so kind of using social media as a way to kind of subliminally kind of tell people that A, it's easy to get to the museum, B, anyone can go, and that there's a whole kind of ranges of ways to get there. But I think we've definitely tried to be, CAM has definitely tried to be a little bit more use kind of longer descriptions in their social media posts to kind of, again, as a way in, right? Not just kind of putting up an image and saying like, okay, here's a work of art that you could see at the museum, but really maybe taking a little bit more time to explain what you're seeing, and then saying, oh, this work is included in this exhibition. But again, that slight shift of not assuming that your audience knows everything or like why we've chosen this work is a way that we've used kind of online platforms to do that. So I'm kind of answering it both ways, both personally and professionally.
Dr. Cooks, I'd love it if you would talk about
Call
accessibility.
her Bridget. I'm going to let you call her
Okay.
Bridget. It's fine.
Thank you for the
She doesn't
permission.
even.
If you wouldn't mind, I'd love it if you could talk about accessibility for Peter Bradley's exhibition in 1971.
You know, can we show some of I think there's maybe just 2 slides that I had in there. So Peter Bradley punches Larry Rivers in the mouth, right? And then he continues with his painting practice. John Dimonel knows about this problem that he had with Larry Rivers and says, I would like you to curate an exhibition to show what Black artists are doing. What are contemporary Black artists doing? And he says, I want you to do what we call the all-Black show. So the tradition in America is that if you're going to show the work of a Black artist in a museum, everyone in the gallery has to be Black, right? It's a long tradition of segregation since the 1920s in mainstream museums, and that's how you show Black artists. You don't actually show them with artists that are not Black because somehow that makes people uncomfortable. So Peter said, I will do a show, but it cannot be an all-Black show. The show has to be integrated, and he said in less polite terms, no self-respecting Black artist wants to be patronized by being segregated in an all-Black show. Okay, so that was his stance, and that was the discourse he was involved in. So there was a Black neighborhood, and in Houston there are different wards. So it was one of the wards that was a particularly lower economic, working class neighborhood, and still is. In Houston that had a movie theater called the Deluxe Theater. And he curated an exhibition called The Deluxe Show. And he hired a number of people who lived in the community to refurbish this theater and change it into a gallery. And he had 19 artists in the exhibition who were Black, white, and Latina. Virginia Jaramillo, who was in Now Dig This, who's also in Soul of a Nation right now, which is at the Broad in LA. And he wouldn't accept payment to curate the exhibition. His friend Clement Greenberg came to the exhibition, wrote about the exhibition. Craig Kaufman, Sam Gilliam, William T. Wiley, William T. Williams, were all artists in the show, and so it was an example of an integrated exhibition. And there was some controversy about it because there were many people who were from the neighborhood that went to the show, and they had never seen work like this before, and they were interested. And Clement Greenberg talks about that. But then there were also people saying, this is a moment of a Black arts renaissance. We have a Black arts aesthetic that we're working with, and this is white art. So why are you bringing this to the community? So it was, I think, a productive discourse because people felt different ways about it. And Peter really felt that Black figurative art was not strong, and it wasn't participating in a mainstream discussion of contemporary art. And he felt that there were Black artists that were making strong work that were participating in that discussion. So that was his stance. Jean Dimonel agreed with that. There weren't any local Black artists from Houston in the exhibition. So it was an experiment, and it was the first integrated abstract art exhibition in American history. And so it was, in a sense, about accessibility.
What year was that, you said?
This was 71.
1971. Wow.
Yeah. In terms of accessibility, it was a way to bring New York artists to this neighborhood. The white artists, except for 2, were really not excited about participating and didn't come to the opening. And Peter was really disappointed in that. But it was an opportunity to have free access, a local space with artwork that had not been in this neighborhood before. And it opened for that exhibition, and then there were 2 more exhibitions after that. There was a show of African sculpture and an exhibition of Joe Overstreet. Yes, there was a solo exhibition of Joe Overstreet. And the Joe Overstreet show is interesting because he showed it there and at Rice University. So they're both in Houston, but one is a white space and one is a black space. So you can see the kind of compromises, experiments, different ideologies. What is black art? We're still asking those questions. But this, in terms of accessibility, it was an important moment to bring this kind of art to this community, and it was an unlikely place for it to be.
I think that takes us into a really great final question that Patricia has before we move into audience Q&A.
So the last question that we have is for everybody, of course. Where do you see the future for the art world? It's an exciting and vibrant moment, and we are seeing more Black curators, curators of color at large, exhibitions dedicated to artists of the African diaspora, growing collections of such artists in different museums. But once again, is this just a fad? What do you all think? And what are some of your current projects or the works of other people that you're seeing that are ensuring this shift in the art world has longevity?
History of the art world, or the future of the art world.
Well, the world has changed, even in this current administration, and it's no going back. That's the way I see it. I mean, even if you look at this audience now, how it has changed. So that's one thing. But I think that art is a business, and it takes money. It takes contributors, donors, all of that. So I don't know how it's going to change, really, but it has changed to some extent. But then on the other hand, you see people who have a lot of money that give their collections to museums, and then museums are obligated to show that work only. And if you don't like it, then don't go. That's one thing. And if they're getting public funding, then just write a letter to the director, write a letter to the curator and say, I'd like to see some work by other people. But the world is changing, and it'll continue to change. It's smaller because of the internet and things like that. I mean, we can see things now in real time. So, yeah, it's changed. We have a long way to go, but it's changed. At least it's changed over the time since I've been making art over the last 40 years.
Maybe to help focus that big question a little bit, we could think about the numbers of alternative spaces that are popping up, like the Underground Museum, like Titus Kafur's space on the East Coast, and also maybe talking a little bit more about the Getty's initiative and funds dedicated to the acquisition of artists of color.
Well, Theaster Gates, what he's doing in Detroit now, or Chicago, and opening up that space. I think also Kehinde Wiley has a residency now in Dakar. So there are artists who are taking control over what they do and how it's presented also.
Mark Bradford to art practice, yeah.
I would agree with Mildred. I mean, there's no going back. I think that now the reality is that we can't keep moving the status quo in terms of not thinking about diverse audiences in many different, not just racially, but also at all economically and everything else. So I think that I think there's made definitely a lot of strides. I think certainly Bridget can speak to this from a historical point of view, but I don't think museums are going back. And I do think that there are a number of initiatives that are making sure that doesn't happen, and, as well as artists that are using the funding from or the sale of their work to continue that conversation and to further that conversation in other ways. Like, so you mentioned Art and Practice, for example, is Mark Bradford's space in Los Angeles and many other spaces that are happening. But you also wanted to speak to what were future projects that we're doing.
Yeah, if it helped answer the question, if you had any future projects that are part of that.
Oh, okay. I think you mentioned already that I'm co-organizing Prospect New Orleans. So Prospect is the 5th iteration of Prospect New Orleans. My colleague and friend and I, Diana Nowie, are working on it. It's going to open October 2020. And so we're really excited. But for those of you who don't know, Prospect New Orleans is a citywide triennial that opened after the Hurricane Katrina. A number of people, Dan Cameron started Prospect New Orleans, Franklin Sermons and Trevor Schumacher have also organized previous iterations. We are the first women to organize Prospect New Orleans, so very excited about that. Oh, okay, not the finger snap. I forgot I'm in Oakland, so yeah, I'm in Berkeley, so yeah. No, we're very, very excited, but no, so usually about 50 to 75 artists, and their work is placed throughout the city, both in terms of in museum spaces and in unconventional art spaces. And then, like I said, it's my first week at LACMA, so stay tuned in terms of what I do there. But so I think Prospect is another way to think about how non-art centers, but it's a flourishing art community, but not New York or LA or Chicago, can continue to kind of enter into and have a dialogue with kind of international art community. So that's one project that's happening. But I think Bridget could really speak to the Getty because I know she's on that actual committee that's working on that project.
Well, I'll just echo the sentiments of both of you. Thinking about some of the things that are happening now that are exciting that have been mentioned, so Art and Practice. Next Haven is Titus Gafar's project where he's helping to professionalize and develop the ideas of recent MFA students. And he also has a program where he's working with emerging curators, working together with high school students in New Haven. So he's working on different levels to try to give people opportunities to, it's a think tank, but it is also about figuring out the kind of skill set you need if this is a world you want to enter into. Mildred is absolutely right. Nothing happens without money. We do have more people, I think, than in previous generations who are African American, who are really interested in art and investing in art and buying art. Thinking about a local person, so Pamela Joyner and Fred Gifrida, a married couple who have invested an incredible amount of money in purchasing abstract art and also touring it as well. And a publication that goes with that. There's a second publication that's coming soon. And Pamela Joyner has been very helpful in this African American Art History Initiative that recently started at the Getty. So I'm on the board of advisors for that. Kelly Jones is the senior consultant. We all love and respect Kelly, and she's an incredible, generous scholar. So I was just honored to be asked. And the two priorities that we have right now with that project are oral histories. I'm conducting a number of oral histories that Naima's already mentioned on the West Coast, and then my colleague Andriana Campbell is conducting oral histories on the East Coast, and we're working with Berkeley's own Oral History Center. And so that's been really fantastic. Yeah, I just talked to Charles Gaines this week. It's 2 days, 8 hours of discussion with an artist. And the first question is, when were you born and where? To what's going to be in your next show at Hauser and Wirth. So you get to know people. In terms of accessibility, this is going to be made available to people at the Getty, and we're planning for it to be online also, so you can have access to it wherever you are. The other priority for the initiative is collecting artist papers. So Betty Saar is the first artist to agree to donate her papers and her archive. So that's notes, sketches, date books, even papers of transactions of sales and materials that just all kinds of things. It's an incredible archive. And so the Getty is also putting money towards accepting a gift, but also in some cases paying artists or artist estates for that material so that they can be resources for future research. And I would say, I don't know how optimistic, I'm going to say I'm skeptical of the future and not optimistic, just in terms of there are lots of exciting things. Certainly there are more people who are more well educated about African American artists. There are more people who are educated and coming out with degrees who are interested in curatorial work. When I went to grad school, there was no such thing as museum studies and curatorial studies in the United States. There was in England, but not here. And you got a degree in art history and then you made it work for you, which is what I've done. But we do have a new generation, and we're seeing future generations who are really interested in work as curators, as educators, and doing other kinds of administrative things, I think more than ever before. So I'm hopeful about that, but I'm also aware of all the statistics that show that historically when mainstream museums have bought work by Black artists, they immediately put it in storage, so no one gets to see it. And I'm also aware that even though there are more and more hires of people of color, not just African American people, but people of different races as well, non-white people, it's really incremental. And the people that are in, the higher you go up in terms of administration, the whiter and maler it becomes. So I think that we are in a moment of transition. I think that substance comes not with just like adding people of color or artworks by people of color, but it's about people changing the way that they see. And it's about perception. That's not something we have statistics on. And a lot of people's identities are very much invested in racist ideologies about beauty and belonging. So that's the part that makes me just sort of like stop and cross my arms and go, well, we'll see. Like, I'm doing what I can, you're doing what you can, as artists, as administrators, as curators. That kind of change, I feel like, is one person at a time. And that's the long haul. So there's lots of different moving parts. So I'm skeptical, but I am part of, I like to think of myself as part of change.
Thank you all so much. So we will now open it up to questions, and I'll be calling on people. There should be a mic that is coming around, and please use it better than I have. And also, we have to be out of here by 3:30, so if people could be mindful of the time that they take to articulate their questions. I know that a lot of exciting things have been said, but we could try and keep as concise as possible to get as many voices and ideas circulating as possible. So.
First, thank you all very much for coming here and for saying everything that you have said so far. I just graduated from my MA and just started in the curatorial department here, and everything you said has been really helpful in thinking of how to move forward. And your last question about the future of museums and diversifying museums beyond just collecting, I think is really important, because we have, Berkeley in particular has been acquiring more works by diverse artists, but we don't, I'm a curatorial assistant, we don't really have anyone on staff or in the department, although we do have great people in the department, to contextualize all of it. I'm thinking in particular of the African art that we're trying to collect. And I wonder if you can speak a little bit to, I think a lot of that is also funding. There isn't a lot of funding within the Berkeley community for, like, say, another position to help contextualize a lot of these pieces so that when they are on display, that they're not just for aesthetics or the aesthetics of diversity, but more actually sharing that culture.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this because it's an issue of education. So, for instance, I teach at UC Irvine. I don't teach any classes I ever took. There were no classes on African American artists. There weren't any art history classes where you could learn about Black artists, period. So, I'm looking into the future of my students, right? Because now it's part of their training. Now, curators today who are of older generations, which is most curators, and I mean older than my students, and I've been teaching for 20 years. So I'm teaching these, I've been teaching people for a generation. Before that, there's even less of a chance that curators have any kind of experience or knowledge about the history of Black artists. And so what I've been thinking about is some kind of boot camp for curators, because I don't think that all curators are racist. I certainly absolutely know that some of them are, but I don't think that they aren't all racist. Sometimes they just don't know where to start. Okay, so you should be able to do research and figure it out. But if there was some kind of boot camp, like a seminar or something, like, okay, here's some other ways to think about American art. If you want to be more diverse, you don't have to make an all-Black show. What if you do a show on landscape? Is it possible that there are African American artists that? Yes, there are. Well, can you, So I think the Getty is also interested in that. One of the things that we've talked about is making resources online as easy to click as possible. We were thinking about for adjunct professors, and I was also thinking about curators to have resources available to them with high-res images, or just trying to make it as easy as possible so that it's an absolutely willful decision if you decide that you're not going to have any artists of color in your show. Since the 1960s, Black artists have been physically demonstrating, protesting museums for doing a show, like the Whitney did a show, paintings of the 1930s. And they couldn't find any, so they weren't looking for any, So if we try to make it as easy as possible, then it's on you. You have to be accountable for your decisions. But I have been thinking about some kind of boot camp seminar, the Mellon Foundation, the Getty, where, it seems remedial and I kind of resent it, to tell you the truth. But at the same time, I would be willing to see how many people show up, and can we have a real honest dialogue about what is it that you do in your work? What is it that you need to know? What would you like your practice as a curator to look like in the future, and how can we help? I'm willing to do that for a little while. And then after that, it's like, because we're already writing the books, we're already making the work, right? It's like we got to lead you, so I'm willing to go with you to a certain point. And that might be one of the next steps.
Just a note for a second, as someone else is preparing for questions, Erin Cristoval at the Hammer Museum also proposed a similar reading group of sorts amongst her staff, which their director, Ann Philbin, supported. Promising.
So just in-house, how do you educate the people in your own house?
Someone else have a question ready to go?
Thank you. Is this on? Yeah. Okay. I was wondering if you can talk a little bit more about when you're thinking about just aesthetic space. I think all of you touched on it a bit, but I think here in the Bay Area, there are a lot of alternative spaces that are looking to do this honest work, that have been doing this honest work for years, whether it be Moad, I know Ashara's here, Ashara's gallery, but thinking about sort of not having a heavy didactic show or exhibition. I know Naomi, you talked about sort of being able to welcome people in the space and it not sort of leading into, you know, having this wealth of knowledge. But that's sort of on the other end of, you know, shows that are not specifically dedicated to Black artists. That's sort of what it is, right? It's a reductive sort of exhibition that isn't always kind of didactic. And so I'm trying to just reconcile the fact that all of you have participated in shows that have really grappled with that, have led folks into this space, have treated it as a learning opportunity, but as well as sort of an ode to the artwork itself. So how are you thinking about it in regards to alternative spaces as well?
Thank you.
So I think we just want to make sure, because Mildred and I were just trying to make sure we're on the same page about the question. So in considering, I guess, alternative spaces, how can they also, I guess, present exhibitions that, sorry, we just want to make sure that we're all on the same page about the question.
Just thinking about like certain spaces in the Bay Area or just in general that have to be, you know, heavily didactic because of the fact that maybe the audience isn't aware of the work. So just dealing with the fact that you know, what's more aesthetically pleasing, let's say, ends up being a little bit reductive in the way that the work is presented. Just very heavy, sterile spaces, white walls. So you can take your example of Kenyatta show and really trying to navigate folks through it, but at the same time reconcile the history without it being so heavily didactic.
I don't know, it's tough because I think that sometimes we don't give communities and the people in those communities enough credit, right? There are some brilliant and amazing, we all know, I'm not saying that. So I think sometimes the assumption, as we all know from LA, but the assumption is that because you live in Watts or because you live in South LA or because the art center may be in a particular place that you have to provide that much more information because otherwise the material is not accessible. And sometimes I want to fight from that. I'm not saying you shouldn't have labels. I'm not saying you shouldn't have wall text. I'm not saying you shouldn't have a brochure, right? So I'm not saying you shouldn't let people in, but I often want people to resist this feeling you have to do more, because that much more, because it's in a neighborhood that you might deem as less sophisticated, right? So I think that there are ways to do that where you give people choice, right? So one of the ways is by having, like I said, exhibition brochure, where it's not necessarily, you know, 50, 75 words accompanying every single piece, but it's allowing you to make that decision, you know, to kind of take the brochure with you and then walk around, you know, the show. Or, you know, the institution could obviously put something online, or, you know, there's other kind of methods, I think, to, or have kind of a reading area, or, you know, there are ways to, I think, allow people to have more information. But again, I want to resist this idea that, okay, you know, a space as in, you know, East Palo Alto needs to have, you know, a crazy amount of didactics because, God forbid, you know, they could understand what's on view. Now, I do think that spaces have to be sensitive to their audiences, right? So I think that you do, and I'm not saying that, you know, if you're in a predominantly African-American neighborhood that you can only show African-American artists, but I do think that you have to kind of, you know, understand. So even at CAM, for example, you know, when I first got there, I was well aware of the types of shows the museum had been doing for a long time, and that, you know, maybe a Charles Gaines show shouldn't be the first show. That I wouldn't do that anyway, but, you know, in terms of like, you know, a deeply conceptual exhibition maybe wasn't the first show that I should come out with, you know, in this way. Not because I didn't think CAM audiences could appreciate it, but I think that's just realizing the types of shows that the institute had been doing and then kind of bringing them on a journey to maybe this new kind of area. So maybe not, you know, the not being so abrupt with a certain type of exhibition and moving into another one. So that's another mechanism. But again, I think that resisting this idea that the space has to in some way lessen, or, you know, the quality, or even like, you know, go overboard on exhibition text because the assumption is that, you know, people can't understand. I honestly think that kind of, I don't want to say ruins the experience, but it just kind of, and also, like, again, I think that I wonder if that further alienates people from then going to museums because the expectation is not met when they go to another space, right? So they go to this alternative space and they see a crap load of text, and then they go to, you know, SF MoMA and they see very little, and it's like, oh crap, so I don't have these tools, right, that I was given at this other place. And on the flip side, again, thinking about CAM, I didn't want CAM to be seen any differently than MoCA, because it shouldn't be, period. So the content is different, the artists may be different. Obviously, it's all black all the time. So yes, that's a little bit different than MoCA's mission. But in terms of the quality of the show, how the work is hung, the labels at 52, like the 6 inches from the work, the whole 9 yards, that I felt was important to look at, that you would see no difference between what was at CAM and what was at the Broad, for example. So.
Okay, we have time for.
Hey, thanks so much. I'm wondering about how much the concept of ethics of care might translate or be under discussion in other communities of color. And I say this as an Asian American who often feels like you don't count as a person of color in America. So I just wonder if you could comment generally on that.
Thank
like maybe work doing with indigenous communities or whatnot.
I would say, yeah, so I think I'm going to repeat the question. So the question is, how might some of these ideas that we've been talking about translate to other communities of color who are not black and not white? Is that right? That's kind of the question? Okay.
Or even like further, I guess, especially Asian communities that may not necessarily be considered.
Dia de los Muertos is one. The Day of the Dead exhibition that happens at the Oakland Museum. I mean, it's a variety of artists from various different cultural backgrounds that participate in that. That's one example.
I was just going to say generally, yeah, I'm trying to think about translate. I'm kind of stuck on that word. So, yeah, there's very specific things about the history of African American people. So you can't necessarily say template, I'm going to use this here and then I'm going to use this here. I think you have to do your research for whatever the context and the content is that you're working with. I'm thinking a lot of different things. So, and I also, in my experience of teaching over, so many years, I have Asian American students that don't consider themselves people of color. And then I have Asian American students that do consider themselves people of color. So there's a lot of diversity, and people can identify themselves any way that they want to. And so those, there are reasons, historical reasons and issues and economic and social and psychological pressures that feed into that. And I think if you're going to be focusing on a particular group that you want to come to the museum or that you want to highlight in an exhibition, that you just need to do your homework. You have to do your research. I think it's helpful to think about what's been happening in the art world for Black artists, but it's not necessarily going to translate and have this meaning. It's not necessarily going to have the same meaning or be received the same way for people that have a different racial experience.
I'd like to plug our show for a second to think about that, because we have this Raymond Saunders piece about things loved, which has never been exhibited before, but it's actually on, it incorporates Chinese characters into the work, and it's on a Japanese-style panel. And as a class, we were working from multiple different disciplines, and we also had specialists in East Asian art history who were actually able to read what was in other languages on this panel. So I think when we're thinking about an ethics of care, it's also about working interdisciplinary to think about how we can bridge multiple audiences' engagement with an artwork like this, particularly from California, thinking about our relationship with the Pacific Rim. and how artists like Mildred Howard and Raymond Saunders are engaging with multiple communities to embrace them in their own artworks. But it's our duty as museum professionals to make that easily understandable to our audiences. Well, thank you all for joining us. We encourage you to please come back after May 17th to see or judge for yourselves how well we've practiced an ethics of care. Thank you all.